Sheryl, for joining us here today and talking with us about one of the principal injustices in the world today, the worldwide abuse and exploitation of women. In your book, Half the Sky, you powerfully chronicle the need for, as well as provide stunning examples of grassroots leadership in helping address the paramount moral challenge of our time. Can you talk with us a little bit about that moral challenge?
Well, first of all, it's nice to meet you, Crystal. Thanks very much for your interest. You know, in many of the same ways that slavery in the 19th century was probably the paramount moral challenge of its time, and in the 20th century it was probably totalitarianism, you know, the evil empire, so to speak, as characterized by the US. We think that the cause of our time right now is gender inequity. It is the injustices and the brutality that is really inflicted on so many people around the world because of their gender. Now, I know that sounds like a really broad statement, but if you actually look at, I mean, why do we study slavery in the history books? If you talk to many students, probably every single one of them has studied slavery, right? I can't imagine them not. And, but in fact, what's really happening with a lot of these girls and women, and they're really girls, they're young girls sometimes, is something not very dissimilar, in fact, extremely similar to what happened during the times of slavery. So in sex trafficking, for instance, what often happens is a girl who's, 12, sometimes as young as like 10 or 9, gets kidnapped and sold to a brothel. Her family often doesn't get any of the money. She's basically kidnapped and sold, and she's forced to work in this brothel. She's not paid a dime, and she often isn't even fed that much because they don't want her to get fat. And so they're really living in a situation where they're like sex slaves. And so the horrible thing about it is that often these girls aren't even worth as much as slaves were worth to their owners in the time of slavery. Those slaves had real economic value. So there was a self-interest to reasonably protect the slave. And in the case of these girls, they're often not protected because they're cheap and they're disposable. First of all, the brothel owners, sometimes they're kidnapped, and depending upon who the kidnapper and the trafficker is, these brothel owners haven't paid much at all, and sometimes they pay $300.
So how did you get involved, and you're as now a leader of this movement?
Well, I wouldn't call myself a leader by any means, and there are so many people who are on the ground working towards saving these girls and trying to eradicate the problem, or at least minimize the problem. And I'd say those organizations who have people working on the ground are really the leaders in the trenches. They've been doing this for many, many years, and there are organizations who've been doing this for decades. I mean, this has been a problem that people have been aware of. I think what our service has been is that we actually have spread the message. We've been able to articulate the problem, which is also very important, and just created greater awareness. And so we're hoping that individuals who take to this, who realize that this is a challenge, will, within their own sphere of influence, try and bring about some change.
Right. And there is, as you acknowledge, difficulty in making people care about this issue. I mean, when people think of it as a women's issue or a girl's issue, just by that nature, it's devalued in some sense. I think you do an amazing job in this book in taking various tacts to make and persuade people to care about this issue. Do you want to talk about some of those approaches you've taken to?
Well, I think one of the most important things is sort of reaching readers in a way that makes them want to do something and bring about change. And in the same way that we were moved by what we saw, but what we could feel and what we could see. And so what we tried to do is replicate that by trying to make people feel and see what we saw. And so I think that by using that approach, we hope we were able to touch a lot of people and get them to try and do something about it in what their skill area is. I mean, we thought that we can play a role by telling the story, and we hope that other people can not only tell the story, but then also do something about it in the field of education, or microfinance, or giving jobs, or creating the mechanism for jobs.
Well, I'll tell you that as an educator myself, I have asked into my 2 classes to read this book, And we are discussing it soon, and I've had students come to me and thank me for assigning the book. I've never in my entire time teaching had that kind of response before we even discussed it. It really is having an impact on our students. So you are certainly doing what you set out to do.
Well, that's so important because it's these students. Some of them are going to be the ones who are going to take this forward and really bring about the change that is so necessary.
Right. And one thing that I was really drawn to in this book, many things, but one is you make a very good and persuasive argument about the importance of educating girls and how educating girls is kind of critical in dealing with a lot of these atrocities that we see. Can you talk a little bit about that, the importance of educating girls?
Well, there are multiple levels of importance. I think that on one level, first of all, it just, why wouldn't you want to educate girls so that they become a positive resource in the world, both socially and economically? If a country is trying to increase its GDP, and we are all trying to increase our GDP, you've got a resource there that is not being utilized. Why don't you utilize it and just elevate the level of your economy or economic output? The other thing is that it really, there are very practical reasons, and one of the most practical reasons has to do with overpopulation. So the world just hit 7 billion people, and now people are talking about, is there going to be enough food?
Yep.
Well, one thing that has been shown is that when you educate a girl for the amount of education that she has, if she carries that education through to adulthood, she tends to get married later on in life, and then she tends to have kids later on in life, and then she tends to have fewer kids. And those kids that she has, she tends to raise in a more enlightened way. So that in itself is just a really practical issue in terms of just population growth. Helping us, tame the population growth. So it's really, I think there are multiple levels in which education can be so critical.
And in addition to education, there's the importance of cultivating the political participation of women, both as voters as well as leaders locally and nationally. Can you talk a little bit about how women as leaders and women as just political participants is really critical to this movement?
Yeah, it's hard. I mean, there isn't a lot of research in this area, but for instance, in India, there are these very famous studies that showed that while it's hard to measure at the national level, it is easier to measure at the impact of women leaders at the local level. So, for instance, a local village chief. So they've discovered that when a woman is a local village chief, she tends to focus on things like getting water, making sure that there is safe access or access to safe water for the village. A very concrete thing because she's probably had to deal with that. And social services tend to be focused on more at the village level when the village chief is a woman. So that's a very practical implication. At the national level, it's harder to say. The Philippines, I can cite one thing, but there really is, it's almost, it's difficult to draw because it's more of a correlation, but the Philippines has had a woman leader and has women, prominent women, role models, and they also tend to be one of the higher ranked countries in the developing world that has more gender inequity than others. So for instance, the World Economic Forum report just ranked the top 135 countries, and Philippines was one of the highest, probably the highest developing country on that list.
Oh, interesting. Yeah. I think it's interesting talking about understanding the influence of particularly high-level female leaders, because you have a lot of factors like you talked about. It's hard to tease out, right? You have a lot of women come into these positions because their husband or their father was assassinated. Right, and so that they're taking on this position, and it's also interesting, there's research in the social sciences that show that oftentimes when things aren't going well in organizations specifically, but people are thinking about this in a larger sense too, maybe politically, people look for female leaders more than male leaders when it's a bad situation, which puts women in a detrimental situation at times, because you're coming in to lead an organization, something that's already kind of unstable. They call it the glass cliff. effect, which is very interesting. But that's something to also consider when you have it's hard to disentangle these effects of high-level female leaders.
Right.
But another thing I was, as a social scientist and social psychologist, was really struck by how you really were able to take a broad look at the situational influences that contribute to the abuse and exploitation of women. So, for example, looking at the power of culture, the power of gender roles that stem from culture, how religion can and cannot, the role that religion plays. Do you want to talk about any or some of the situational factors that contribute to these kind of more dire situations for women worldwide?
Well, I think culture is a really hard thing to attack, and it's often the Westerner who's saying this is a terrible practice. But there are some things that really are pretty offensive, and so when people say in the defense of culture, oh, this is our culture, I wouldn't just say, okay. I mean, I really think that it still requires scrutiny in the same way that, foot binding, practice in China for centuries. And if the West just, oh, that's just culture, women in China would still have bound feet, and you would not have this economic juggernaut that you have that is fueling the world. So it's in our interest to really examine some of these practices and say, well, it's not really a good practice, and in fact, your culture would probably even be better without it. And so that's true of, genital cutting. And I mean, there are a lot of similarities to foot binding, and there is an organization called Tostan which is using some of the practices, the successful practices that the eradicators of foot binding used in Africa, and she's having enormous success. And the key there is that you focus on communities. You say this is not just an isolated, you have to go from mother to mother or father to father to tell them not to bind the girl's feet or cut the daughter, but it really is community-based. So you have to educate the entire community so that because it is embedded in the culture, if the daughter is not cut, then she won't get married. So you have to get communal agreement that it's okay, these girls who we will spare are actually great girls and you should want to marry them, and this side has to say, yes, we will marry them. So she's used that approach, and it has been so successful. And it also means that you can actually eradicate it community by community, not one by one.
Right. So this points to the importance of grassroots leadership. So a lot of this is seemingly intractable problem at first glance, at first blush. But what you do in this book, and I think is so you break it down, you try to look at it piece by piece, and you make it more manageable, where we can understand that we individually can make a difference, and you talk about what seems like the best approaches, and sometimes what approaches that seem like they're going to be good turn out to have some unexpected results that turn out not to be good. But would you talk a little bit more about the grassroots leadership and how important that is in dealing with this?
Well, I think it gets back to the whole issue of culture. So there is no way that a Westerner from the outset can just say change, and here I'll tell you how to change. It won't work, and it didn't work with the foot binding. And that wasn't what turned it around. What really works is if their voices in the local community, if people locally say, we agree that this is wrong. And often if there is a practice that is just so offensive to the majority of people in the world, more likely that it will be offensive to people inside those communities as well, but they just don't have the guts, or they wouldn't dare admit it.
Right.
And so the key is to give them, or find those people who want to bring about change, and give them the support from the outside, but they have to bring about the change because they know how to do it. They know the social mores, they know how to push, how to pull, how to build networks. So you really do need to work with them.
So what would you recommend that we, let's say people in the West, is there something we can do to help deal with this issue?
In general?
In general,
okay.
Or even more specific examples of what it is, other concrete examples of how we can get involved in this movement.
Well, I think probably the best way to do is, because everybody has their own expertise and their own passion. And I think what's really important is that you have to find a certain challenge that you're passionate about, because otherwise, you'll do it for a year and then, it'll go away. And so then find one issue that you care. I mean, this is a huge, broad challenge facing women and girls around the world, and there's lots of different mini challenges. So, for each individual, they should find something that they care about. And then find a region of the world that they care about. Some people care about Afghanistan, some people care about, Cambodia, some people care about Uganda or Congo, and other people care about, Vietnam. So you really have to figure out where you want to put your focus. And then try and do it with some friends, because that just elevates the level of intellectual inquiry, and also helps galvanize you to action, because you can do it with a club of friends, and figure out what you want to do together, either through an organization that's already working on the ground there, or volunteering in some aspect, or trying to figure out how you can use your career or particular expertise or your skills in this particular area. I mean, global health, so Doctors Without Borders does remarkable things. I guess there's the equivalent of Lawyers Without Borders and Bankers Without Borders, and so it goes on and on. So,
so can I ask you, is there a specific project, whether book project or other, that you're working on right now?
Well, right now we are helping out with a documentary series on the book. And so there has been a group of people, filmmakers, who are working on a documentary series based on the principles in the book and the challenges and the solutions. And it really happened in a way that was just perfect for what we were trying to do. So, for instance, when the team came to us, I thought, okay, well, let's go to PBS, or the organization that oversees PBS, which is ITVS. And we presented this idea. We think it's a great idea for a documentary series, and then a colleague of mine was also doing another documentary series, and we went to them and said, look, don't look at us as rivals. If you do them together, you could do 2 series, and that would make the issue even bigger. So they went back and they thought about it, and they actually one-upped us like multiple times. They decided to do a 3-year program with 50 films. Wow. So the multiplier effect was enormous, and that's the exact kind of thing that we're hoping to help to trigger, is really a multiplier effect.
Absolutely. That's amazing. That's great. I am looking forward to that. Well, I want to thank you for taking some time to chat with me today. And your book truly, to me, is a pivotal call, for action, and does a remarkable job of, I think, making unreasonable people out of all of us. And that I am saying that in reference to the quote that you had that you put in your book from George Bernard Shaw: "Reasonable people adapt themselves to the world. Unreasonable people attempt to adapt the world to themselves. All progress, therefore, depends on unreasonable people." Thank you for being unreasonable.
Thank you, Crystal.
Thank you.